Material chess. Side 1. The object of the game may be to mate the opposing king, but you'll find the simplest way to win is to capture your opponent's pieces. And when you have a large enough advantage, he'll be too weak to resist your attacks on his king. Your first task is to learn to see the attacks by one piece upon another, so you can take your opponent's men, but not let him take yours. Now set up diagram 1, please. How many captures do you see for white here? Switch off and decide. I make it 5. White rook at b2 attacks the black pawn at b4, and the queen at f2. White queen at d3 attacks rook at a6. Knight at d6 attacks pawn at f7, and bishop at d1 attacks pawn at g4. Seeing the captures is one thing. Deciding which captures to make is another. For example, if you were white, would you capture the pawn at g4 or the rook at a6? Or would you perhaps make another capture? To answer this question, you need more information. First of all, you need to know the relative values of the pieces. All the pieces move differently, and some are stronger than others. Obviously, a queen is worth more than a pawn. For material chess, we have a scale of values, which counts the pawns as 1 point. Bishop and knight are both worth 3 points. Rook is worth 5 points, and queen worth 9 points. Now this table is mainly based on the number of squares a piece can control. So you might be surprised that the bishop is regarded as equal to the knight, even though the bishop at its best controls 13 squares, whereas the knight's maximum is only 8. However, bear in mind that the knight can jump over other pieces, and also that he's not confined to squares of one colour. This is probably the main factor which makes the rook superior to the bishop. The rook covers squares of both colours, even though at its maximum it only can control 14 squares to the bishop's 13. So the rook is worth 5 points, bishop 3. The queen, combining the action of rook and bishop, is the strongest piece of all. Now what about the king? Well, at the beginning of the game, he's a positive liability. I suppose you could almost give him minus points. But later on, when there are hardly any pieces left on the board, and he's not in danger of getting mated, well, he becomes quite useful, possibly worth 3 or 4 points. Of course, from one point of view, his value is infinite, because if you lose him, you lose the game. When you come to the cassette on positional chess, we'll look more carefully at the relative values of the pieces, but this table will do for the time being. Now return again to diagram 1, and with your new information, I want you to put the captures in order of value. Well, the best capture to make is rook on b2 takes queen. That wins 9 points. Next, the queen taking the rook. That collects 5 points. The other captures are pickings at a point each. The next thing to look for is whether the piece attacked is defended or not. If it is defended, then you'll lose your piece for the enemy's piece when you take it. However, it may still be worthwhile making the capture if your attacking piece happens to be worth less than the one you're going to take. Set up diagram 2 now. Here you are white. You have a choice of several captures. Some of the enemy pieces are defended, some aren't. I want you to spot all the captures, then put the captures in order of how many points they gain, even assuming that the opponent would recapture. Let's see all the white captures. Pawn b5 takes pawn on a6. Queen c4 takes rook on e6. Knight f3 takes bishop. Bishop c2 takes knight. Bishop h2 takes the queen on b8. That's 5 captures. Now only the knight at h7 and the pawn at a6 are undefended, so the knight at h7 would gain a clear 3 points. Now if we play queen takes rook, that gains us 5 points, but then loses us immediately 9 points, because black would recapture the queen. So minus captures are no use. The best capture is bishop takes queen on b8, and even after black recaptures with the knight, white gains 9 points and loses 3, total gain 6 points. So that was the best capture, followed by bishop takes knight on the undefended piece, the second best capture. While you're attacking your opponent's pieces, he could be attacking yours. The next dimension in chess playing is to be able to see his attacks as well as your attacks. Now set up diagram 3. First question: which pieces does white attack and which are defended? Turn off and decide. Well, I make it there are 4 attacks, and 2 of them are on undefended pieces. White bishop takes rook on a7 would gain 5 points, and white queen takes bishop would gain 3 points. The other captures do not gain or even lose material. Next question: what are black's attacks and which pieces are defended? Switch off and decide. Here again, I think there are 4 attacks, and all the white pieces are defended. Of the attacks that black is making, only one, knight takes queen on d1, would gain material. Now when there are attacks for both sides, the attacks of one side can influence those of the other. Let's say it's white to play. What do you think would be his best move? At first sight, bishop takes rook on a7 is the best capture, but then black replies knight takes queen on d1, and white would play knight takes knight. Now black's gained a queen, 9 points, against a bishop and rook, 8 points. So in fact black came out best in that little skirmish. Now there's a better capture for white, which takes into account black's threats. He can play queen takes bishop on d6, and this wins him a clear 3 points, but doesn't lose him his queen. Seeing attacks is something that comes with practice, and this is the sort of practice you should be doing in your first chess games. To help you along, you'll find in the booklet several exercises which will get you used to seeing attacks. However, in chess, if a piece is attacked, that doesn't mean it will necessarily be captured. And this leads us to the next section. Part 2. MCSB. Please have the board set up in the start position. Play 1 white pawn to e4, black pawn to b6, white pawn from d2 to d4, black bishop from c8 to b7. At this moment, the bishop threatens the pawn at e4. Is it defended? No, it's not. So what does white do? There are 4 main possibilities. The first thing you might do is to move the pawn, in which case you could play pawn from e4 to e5. The second thing you might do is to capture the enemy piece attacking you. Well, this is impossible here. Thirdly, you can support your attacked piece. Now, switch off here and decide how many moves you have which will support the pawn. There are lots of moves: white bishop to d3, white knight to d2 or c3, white pawn to f3. Then there are the queen moves, and there are 4 of them: d3, e2, f3, g4. That makes 8 moves in all. In each case, if black now captured the pawn at e4 with his bishop, he would be the loser, as white would then take his bishop, which is worth 3 points, and only lose 1 point. The main thing to remember about supporting an attacked piece is to make sure that the piece you are supporting is not worth more than its attacker. For example, let's play our queen out to g4 and defend our pawn at e4. Now black plays knight from g8 to h6. Do I hear anyone suggesting defending the queen at this point with pawn to h3 or bishop to e2? I hope not. If white plays, say, bishop e2, knight takes queen, bishop takes knight, then white would have lost 9 points to 3, an overall loss of 6 points. So much for support. There's still another way to meet an attack. Go back to the start position and play white pawn e4, black pawn b6, white pawn d4, black bishop to b7. Now you can also block the attack on your man by putting something in the way, as long as that something is defended, not worth more than its attacker. Do you see how to block the attack here? Yes, play white pawn from d4 to d5. Now black cannot take the pawn as it's defended by its partner at e4. So that's the 4 ways to meet an attack: move, capture, support, or block. We call them MCSB for short. I'd like to give you a couple of exercises in MCSB. Set up diagram 4. Now play the move black queen from d8 to b6. This attacks our man at b2. Decide what moves you have at your disposal to avoid losing material. So switch off and think about that question. Well, you can move the bishop, a3 or c1. You can't capture the black queen. You can support the bishop lots of ways. Rook b1, queen b1, queen to c1, to c2, to d2, to e2. Finally, you can block by queen d1 to b3. The queen would be defended on b3 by its pawn at a2, and it isn't worth more than the piece attacking it. If black plays queen takes b3, white pawn takes b3, well, that's an exchange, and not a gain of material for black. There's still a 5th way of meeting an attack on your man, and that is by counterattack. Take a look at diagram 5, if not 6. No, it's 5. Here, the white rook at b3 is under attack from the knight at a5, and white, it seems, must move it. Supporting is no good, as the knight is worth less than the rook, and you can't block a knight attack, I'm afraid. However, white can counterattack by playing bishop from c2 to e4, attacking the undefended black rook at a8. If black now played knight takes rook on b3, white needn't recapture pawn takes knight, but would play bishop takes rook on a8. Of course, if black saw the attack on his rook and moved it to b8 instead of taking white's rook, white would then have to move his rook anyway, next move, unless he found something else to attack. Now, in general, I don't advise you to use this defensive method yet, because it leads to more complicated play, and you might not be able to handle it. So only if you're desperate and the regular MCSB defenses don't seem to work, then try the counterattack. For example, set up diagram 6. Here black plays bishop f8 to g7. What would you now do as white? Switch off and think. Moving the rook is impossible. Capture of the bishop is not on. Support, there's no support. Blocking by knight c3 loses a knight because the knight's undefended. Can you see any way out? Yes, counterattack. Play knight from b1 to d2. And if black plays bishop takes rook, then white knight takes rook on c4, and white hasn't lost any material. Part 3. Multiple attacks on the same square. From the start position, make the moves 1. White pawn from b2 to b3. Black pawn from e7 to e5. White pawn to e3. Black pawn to d5. White bishop to b2. Here, white attacks the black pawn, and black defends it with knight from b8 to c6. White could now attack the pawn again, with pawn to f4. Here, black, using our MCSB rule, has got a wide choice of defense, but we'll say here he defends with black pawn to f6. White brings another piece out. This is knight from g1 to f3, attacking the pawn at e5 again. And again, black defends with queen from d8 to e7. This sort of thing can go on quite a long time. And here we have lots of defenders and lots of attackers, all aiming at the same square. Who will come out best? In multiple attacks on the same square, there are three things to consider: the number of attacking pieces, their value, and finally, the order that the captures are made. Please go back to the start position again. Play white pawn to d4. Now black wishes to play pawn to g5. But he sees that white will play bishop takes g5 if he does. So he plays first black pawn to e6. White goes knight from g1 to f3. Black bishop from f8 to e7. White knight from b1 to c3. Black pawn from g7 now moves up to g5. Now, here I want you to switch off and decide whether white should capture on g5 or not. White has two pieces attacking g5, the knight at f3 and the bishop at c1. Black has got two pieces defending. If white plays knight takes g5, black bishop takes g5, white bishop takes g5, black queen takes g5. Black will have won bishop and knight for bishop and pawn, so black will be 2 points ahead. The rule is here that if you want to capture on a square, you must have more attackers than there are defenders. And in this case, white had 2 attackers against 2 defenders, so he couldn't take the square g5 and the pawn on it. The exception to this rule concerns the value of the attacking and defending men. And this is fairly simple to understand. Back to the start position again. Play 1 white pawn from d2 to d4. Black pawn h7 to h6. White knight f3. Black pawn from g7 to g5. Now here, how many pieces attack g5 and how many defend? We have 2 white attackers and only 1 defender. So can white capture at g5? Not in this case. If he plays knight takes g5, black pawn takes g5, white bishop takes g5, he's gained 2 pawns, but he'll lose a piece, so he'd be down a point. Let's have another example. Set up diagram 7, please. Here we have a position, and as black, let's say you want to play b7 to b5. However, you'll see that the square b5 is attacked by 2 enemy men, the knight at c3 and the bishop at e2. Now, can you see a way in which you can still threaten to play pawn from b7 to b5. Switch off and think about this. If you chose to play bishop from c8 to d7, this doesn't threaten pawn to b5 because white still has a 2-to-1 attack on that square. However, you can shortcut this by playing pawn from a7 to a6. Then, when you play pawn to b5, white won't dare to capture at b5 because he'll lose more material than he gains. So, let's turn the board round, in our heads that is. As white, after black's pawn to a6, how would you prevent black playing pawn to b5? Once again, numbers won't answer the question here. If white attacks the square b5 with his queen by playing queen to b3, black will go ahead merrily with pawn to b5. No, you need a pawn to fight a pawn. Play instead white pawn from a2 to a4, and this stops black pawn to b5 for a long time. In order to force it, black would need at least 2 more pieces attacking b5 besides the pawn he's already got. The final factor in multiple attacks is order of capture. You may have more men attacking a square, but if you capture in the wrong order, you're still likely to lose out. Let's go back to the start again. Play for white pawn from e2 to e4, black pawn e7 to e5, white knight g1 to f3, black pawn from d7 to d6, white pawn from d2 to d4. Here black makes a mistake. He doesn't see that white is now attacking e5 twice, and he's only defending it once. He plays pawn to b6 here. Now, which piece would you capture with first? The order is important. If you play white knight on f3 takes e5, black pawn takes e5, white pawn takes e5, you'll have lost a piece for 2 pawns. It's better to play first white pawn takes on e5, and then black recaptures with his pawn, and then you play knight takes e5, in which case you gain 2 pawns to 1, and that leaves you a pawn up. Now let's see another example. Set up diagram 8 and tell me if black can play pawn from d6 to d5 here. Switch off and decide this question. As this is a more complicated example, we're going to play the move pawn d6 to d5, make all the captures, and then start counting. Of course, in a chess game, you'd have to do this in your head. Before we make the captures, we'll see that white's got 4 pieces attacking the d5 square, knight, pawn, queen and rook behind the queen. And black has got 2 pieces, the knight on f6 and the bishop on e6, and they've now been joined by the rook on d8 at the point that black played pawn to d5. So here black's outnumbered 4 to 3. Is he going to lose out? We'll make all the captures. Remember that we should always capture with our weakest piece possible and then gradually build up. So play white pawn takes d5, black knight takes d5, white knight takes d5, black bishop takes d5. So far, both sides are equal. They've lost a knight and a pawn each. But now, if white wants to capture on d5 by playing queen takes d5, black rook takes d5, white rook takes d5, he'll lose a queen for a rook and bishop, and that's 9 points to 8. So the answer to the question is yes, black is able to play pawn to d5, due to the order in which white has to capture these pieces. Now, please reset diagram 8, but this time put the white queen at d1 and the white rook at d2. Just change their places. Now, can black play pawn to d5 this time? Making the captures again, white wins the battle of the square. Numbers triumph. White pawn takes d5, black knight takes d5, white knight takes d5, black bishop takes d5, white rook takes d5, black rook takes d5, white queen takes d5. The last piece that captured on the square was the white queen, so white has won a piece. Remember the rule for multiple captures: numbers, value, and order, and always capture with the weakest piece possible, and gradually build up to the strongest pieces. We should now look at an actual beginner's game, and I'm going to give you practice in putting your newfound knowledge into action. From the start position, play white pawn from d2 to d4, black pawn from d7 to d5, white knight from b1 to c3. Now, does this move attack anything? Should black take action against it? What do you think? Well, there is an attack on the black d pawn, but it's defended by the black queen, so there's no need to worry yet, and black can make some other move. Black played g7 to g6. White moved knight from g1 to f3. Black played bishop from f8 to g7. Does this move threaten a capture? No, it attacks the d4 pawn, but this pawn is defended twice. If black takes, he will lose his bishop. White played here e2, pawn from e2 to e4. What do you think black should play now? Switch off and decide. You should spot now that black's pawn at d5 is in danger, attacked twice by the white pawn at e4 and the white knight at c3, but only defended by the black queen. So action must be taken. M, C, S, or B. White's pawn at e4, by the way, is attacked once and defended once, so white won't lose material if black captures at e4. Now in the game, black actually played pawn from f7 to f5. What would you do now as white? Quite right. Black's last move did nothing about the undefended pawn at d5, and white should now play e4 takes on d5, which wins a pawn. However, white did not do this, but played bishop from c1 to e3. Your move as black. Decide on what are the capture situations and whether you can take any advantage of one of them. Switch off and have a think. Black's pawn at d5 is still in danger, but so now is the white pawn at e4, attacked twice, but defended only once. Black took advantage of this by playing d5 takes e4, winning a pawn at e4, and also solving the problem of his own attacked pawn at d5. Unfortunately, white was here rather obstinate and played knight from c3 takes on e4, which lost him a piece after pawn f5 takes e4. Okay, that's one gone. Have a look again at the capture situation on the board. Pinpoint the danger areas. What did you see? The black bishop at g7 plus the queen at d8, both bearing down on the white pawn at d4, but this is defended 3 times. However, there is another attack in the position. What about the black pawn at e4? Doesn't this attack a knight at f3? Remembering the MCSB rule, which move do you think would be appropriate here? Switch off. There's only one appropriate thing to do here, and that's to move the knight. White didn't, so black took it next move. 2 pieces down in 7 moves. Don't think I can stand any more. I think from this game you can see how useful it is to look for the attacks and captures. Because white didn't, he lost material very quickly, and with a little more care he really need not have done so. Material Chess, Side 2. Now for a bit of practical advice. As you play a game of chess, the situation changes move by move. New attacks and capture possibilities are continually arising, and you have to keep track of them. So when your opponent moves, don't rush forward with your answer. See if his last move attacked any of your men, or if he actually put his own piece in danger. It's a little more difficult when it's your turn to move. You might not be able to tell if you've made a mistake until you actually make the move on the board, and then it's too late, since in chess, once you've played a move, you can't ask for it back. The only way to get around this problem is to ask yourself, before you actually make the move, whether the piece you move is going to be in danger on its next square. Just that question. Is the piece going to be in danger on the new square? So here I've given you a playing routine. After your opponent's move, see if the piece he moved attacked any of your men, or whether this piece is in danger. Then, just before you move, check that the piece you're moving isn't going to be lost on its new square. Some of you listening may have a chess computer in your possession, and they're marvelous ways of training oneself in the beginning stage. Now, the good thing about the computers is that you can make the move on the board, and then you have to key it in on the keying board, or you have to press some enter button. Now, this gives you the chance, once you've made the move on the board, to check whether you've moved your piece into danger. And then, once you've checked that everything's all right, then you key it in or press the enter button. So this is something which can help you when you play computers, though of course you can't use it when you're playing human beings. Now, the general playing routine I've given you is not entirely foolproof, because it doesn't take into account the indirect attacks, and the indirect attacks are going to be dealt with in the next section. Part 4. Indirect attacks. What is an indirect attack? An indirect attack is another way for you and your opponent to lose pieces without really noticing it. Set up diagram 9. Here white, who'd learned a bit about material chess, checked all the attacks on the board and decided that his e-pawn was in danger. Of the 4 options at his disposal, he decided to support, and he played bishop from f1 to d3. However, the move was a minor disaster, because black now could either choose to capture the white pawn at g2 or the white pawn at d4. So what happened? Black wasn't threatening to take anything last move, except the pawn at e4, and white defended that, and he didn't place the bishop in danger on d3. But here, all of a sudden, black can pick up 2 of the white pawns. The pawns were lost indirectly. White's move bishop from f1 to d3 removed the guardian of the pawn at g2. It also blocked the defense to the d4 pawn. Now, besides closing a line, it's also possible to open a line unexpectedly by moving a different piece. Set up diagram 10. Here you are white, and I want you to find 3 attacks on undefended black pieces. And that doesn't mean play rook from c1 to c8, which loses the rook. So switch off here. Did you find the 3 attacks? 2 were easy. White rook from c1 to c7, attacking the bishop at e7. White knight from e2 to c3, attacking another bishop at a4. The third move was to play pawn from e4 to e5. The pawn attacks nothing, but it clears the way for the bishop at f3, which now attacks the rook at a8. By now you may be feeling that attacks can come at you from all directions. However, there is a reasonably easy way to spot these indirect attacks. The piece that just moved may not have made the attack, but it had something to do with it. So when the opponent moves, besides looking at the threats from or against the piece, you should also look for things like removal of guard, closing or opening of lines that can be used for capture. And before you make your own move, go through a similar routine in your head. It's time now to look at another game, and I've chosen this one because even though it's a beginner's game, you'll be able to see things like removal of guard, line opening and closing in action. Start white one pawn from b2 to b4. Black plays pawn from e7 to e5. Decide now your move for white. Yes, the b pawn is under fire. This is our first example of indirect attack from the bishop at f8. White should take appropriate measures, either to defend or move the pawn forward, since he can't block or capture the attacker. Though some of you may have discovered a good counterattack here in playing your bishop from c1 to b2, which would hit the black e-pawn, also undefended. Anyway, on with the game. White played knight from b1 to c3, losing a pawn. Black answered pawn from f7 to f6, not taking it. At least if you play other beginners, you sometimes get a second chance. White played now pawn from b4 to b5. Black moved bishop from f8 to d6. White knight from c3 went back to b1. I don't know what that was for. Black now played queen from d8 to e7. And white moved pawn from a2 to a3. Now, is this pawn in danger on a3? It's attacked twice, but it's defended 3 times. So it isn't in danger. Black captured it. The fool. Bishop d6 takes pawn on a3. White knight from b1 takes on a3. Here, mercifully, black did not play queen takes a3, which is just as well. He'd have lost his queen after the bishop. Instead, black played pawn from c7 to c6, and white played pawn on b5 takes on c6. Black pawn d7 took on c6. White knight from g1 went to f3. Black queen from e7 went to c5. Now check the attacks in this position, especially the ones by the black queen. White's pieces don't attack much. His knight at f3 attacks the e-pawn, but this is defended twice. Black's queen attacks 3 points, f2, c2 and a3. All are defended, so there's no immediate danger. White's next move was pawn from c2 to c3. Black played pawn from e5 to e4. Choose a move for white. This is another attack, and the threat is pawn takes knight on f3. Blocking, capturing, support, all out of the question here, so white must move. He played knight from f3 to h4. Black played pawn from b7 to b5, and white played pawn from d2 to d4. Now you're black again, and please choose a move. Switch off and think about it. If you saw the last move of white threatened your queen, you've done well, and if you moved the queen, this would be a good idea. But perhaps you noticed the last move removed the guard on the pawn at c3, and and black can play here. Queen takes on c3 check, winning a pawn. This move black did play. Now, as white, study the new attacks in the new situation and decide on your reply. Switch off here. A queen can be a deadly piece. The black queen is attacking white pieces at d4, e1, a1, a3, c1. One of the pieces is a king, so the attack must be attended to. Of the other pieces in the attack, all are defended except the rook on a1, which looks to be in mortal danger. Now, can you find a move to get out of the check and save the rook at the same time? Of the options at your disposal, move, capture, and support are impossible. You can only block. If you play your queen from d1 to d2, black could then play queen takes rook on a1. However, play instead of queen to d2, play bishop from c1 to d2. This move is a direct and an indirect defense. As well as doing the obvious thing of stopping the check, it also opens the line from the queen at d1 to the rook at a1. The drawback of this move is that by opening one line, it closes another. The white pawn at d4 is now undefended, and black captured it with queen from c3 takes on d4. Unquestionably, however, white made the right decision last move. Losing a pawn is much less serious than losing a rook. White played now pawn from e2 to e3, and black retreated his attacked queen from d4, stepped back to d5. White now played queen from d1 to h5 check. Your move is black. Switch off here. Move, capture, or block. Which is best? You've only got three choices with a king. It's no use supporting a king. So, which move did you choose? I hope it was to capture. Black queen at d5 takes the white queen at h5. White's last move was a terrible mistake which lost a queen. As white now, decide on your next move. You now have a knight attacked, and anywhere you move it, it'll be taken. So white defended the knight with pawn from g2 to g3. Black played pawn from b5 to b4. White to play again. Switch off here. Another attack. We have a very aggressive opponent, I can see that. MCSB. Support and block, they're out of the question. But capture is quite possible. So, bishop takes pawn on b4. Black played knight from b8 to a6. White moved the attacked bishop, bishop b4 to d6. Black played queen from h5 to a5 check. White king moved from e1 to e2. Black queen from a5 moved to c3. Oh dear, queen's back again. Check all the attacks, see which ones are dangerous, and then decide your course of action. The main danger is to the rook at a1, but white didn't move it. No, he played bishop from f1 to g2, and black swooped in with queen takes a1, only to be met by rook from h1, captures the queen at a1. In this case, black did not read the signs. The last move played looked quite harmless, but it was an indirect defense by opening the line from the rook at h1 to defend its friend at a1. That's all the moves I have recorded of this game, so I don't know how it finished. We'll leave it here. Section 4.5. The mate in 1. Part of your training in material chess must include seeing mates in one. Now, you won't get that chance very often in your games, but if it does happen, then it's a golden opportunity that you shouldn't miss. Now, set up diagram 11 on your boards. See if you can find a mate in one. In this position, white played bishop takes pawn on h7, which was check, but not mate. The king had got two squares to go to, and it went to one of them. If white had been looking for mates in one, he'd have played queen takes pawn on h7, and that would have been mate. Now, in the booklet, you'll find several other examples of mates in one. I'd like you to do those exercises, and that will help you to see these possibilities in your own games. Part 5. How to make progress. Your progress in chess should not be measured by how many games you win, but by their quality. In this section, I'll make suggestions about how to go about progressing your chess game in the fastest way possible. First of all, you must write your games down as you play them. Now, this is a tedious task, and you won't enjoy doing it any more than you'll enjoy following the advice on this tape about looking for attacks. However, if you don't write down the games, you won't be able to mark them. And if you can't mark them, you won't be able to measure your progress. At the end of this tape, I'll give you an example of writing down games and marking them. Now, after you've played a game, either go through it again by yourself, or better still with a stronger player. At this stage, you should only look at the material moves, that is, errors which lose pieces and pawns by both yourself and your opponent. Your target should be to play 20 moves of a game of chess without losing a piece to a material error, and that includes capturing any of your opponent's pieces if he makes a material error. That means, therefore, that don't bother too much about the pawns. Of course, you shouldn't try and lose them, but the aim at the moment is to ensure you don't lose a piece within 20 moves, or you can take your opponent's pieces if they're left en prise. En prise being the word for a piece left around to be captured. Now, when you've listened to this tape, besides playing several games with players of your own strength and writing them down, you should also listen to the tape on finishing off and opening play. However, I don't advise you to go any further in the series and listen to the other tapes, not until you've achieved the first target I just set you. Now, when you've reached that target, then listen to the tapes on attacking the king, endgame play, and tactics. But don't go on to the positional tapes at the end of the series until you've reached target number 2. And target number 2 is to play a whole game without making material errors of any kind. That means not even losing pawns to a material attack. Now, when you can do this, then you'll already not be a beginner, in my opinion, and you'll be able to tackle the subtler ideas of positional chess, but not before. Part 6. Writing your games down and marking them. Now we'll try and write down a game in a conventional manner. The first thing you do after you've set up the pieces on the board is to check that the board's the right way round. That is, you've got to have a black square in the top right-hand corner. Then check that the kings and queens are on the right square. White queen should be on a white square, and the black queen should be dead opposite her. It's quite easy to make these two mistakes. If you happen to have a board which has got the little letters around the side of it, which help you with algebraic notation, well, then make sure that your white pieces start on the first rank and that the black men are on the 8th rank. Again, it's often quite easy to set the board up the wrong way around, and then when you start to write the moves down, you start to write them down topsy-turvy. Now, get yourself a piece of paper, and hopefully it should be lined. And now divide it into two columns. One for the white moves, one for the black moves. The white moves go in the first column. So head the first column with the word white, capital letters, and the second column should be headed with the word black. Then write down the names of the players underneath the words white and black. So we'll say for this game, white will call H. Sims, and black in this game will be James Shute. Now, next thing to do is to put the numbers 1 to 10 down the side of the page. These are going to be the move numbers. Usually, of course, your game will last much longer, but this particular game we're going over to, we're going to stop before we get to move 10. Now we're ready to start. Play the move white pawn from d2 to d4 on your board. Now when you've done that, you now have to write the move down. Now, as a pawn has been moved, we don't have a symbol for the pawn. We just say the square it went from and the square it went to. Now it went from d2, so we'd write d in small letters, use small letters for squares. So write d2 and dash, the dash signifying it moved to. So d2 dash d4, and that should be put in the same line as the number 1, so that's why it's first move. Now still on the same line, we're going to write black's next move when I've told it to you. So black here played knight from b8 to c6, so make this move on the board. Now this is a piece move, and all the pieces have got a symbol. As I said, the pawns don't have a symbol. Now N would stand for knight, Q would stand for queen, R would stand for rook, B for bishop, and K for king. And all these are going to be capital letters, which distinguishes them from square names. Squares have little letters. Right, so this move is going to be, black's move is going to be knight, so that's N, B8 dash C6, if you'd write that down. Now we go on to the second move, so make on your board the move white knight B1 goes to A3. And write down the move N B1 dash A3. Capital letter for N, little letter for the squares. Black's second move was knight C6 takes on D4. Make this move. And now write it down. N C6. Now what do we do for takes? We don't put a dash. In this case, we put a little x. X means it captured. So N C6 X D4. White's third move was queen D1 took on D4. So make this move. And now write it down. QD1 XD4. Black played pawn from D7 to D5. Make the move on the board. And write it down. But don't forget, no symbol for pawn, just D7-D5. Now we play white's fourth move. Queen D4 takes D5. Q D4 X D5. Write it down after you've made the move on the board. Black plays Queen D8 takes D5. So this is Q D8 X D5. White's fifth move, knight G1 to F3. So write that N G1 dash F3. Black played queen from D5 to D8. Have you made this move? Black queen from d5 dash d8. Queen d5 dash d8. White's sixth move. Bishop from c1 goes to g5. Make the move. B c1 dash g5. Black answers splendidly. Pawn from e7 to e6. Make the move. Write it down. e7 dash e6. No symbol for pawn. Seventh move. Bishop g5 captures queen on d8. So here we would just write, after you made the move, B, capital B, g5 x d8. We don't say the piece it took, just the square it captured on. Black king e8 takes on d8. Make the move. King e8 x d8. K for king, of course, yeah. And now, eighth move. White knight from a3 to c4. This is n a3 dash c4. Black's eighth move. Bishop c8 to d7. Well, that's as many moves as I want to go through. And now what we're going to do is to go through the game together and mark it. So reset your pieces in the start position. Now play the move d2 to d4. Black knight b8 c6. White knight b1 to a3. Here black played knight c6 takes d4. And white played queen d1, took on d4. Now black's last move captured a piece which was defended, therefore a material error. Now, for material error, you should get a little red pen and write a capital M beside the offending move. In this case, this would be knight c6 takes on d4. In fact, you should write M minus. Now, M with a single minus means that the person lost a pawn by his material error. M double minus means that he lost a piece, at least. So this move would be an M double minus. So black on his second move would be well away from our first target. Now, move 3 for black was d7 to d5, and white played here queen takes on d5, and this again is a material error, M double minus, because it loses a piece, or more. Well, can't lose more than a piece, but it's a big piece, isn't it? So black played queen d8 takes d5. Now things go quiet for a little while. White knight g1 to f3. Black queen d5 to d8. Thinks he's safe here. Bishop c1. White's bishop on c1 went to g5. And here black played e7 to e6. And this was an example of opening a line against your own man. So this was an example of allowing an indirect attack. And white now played bishop g5, took on d8. So white got his queen back here. And by black's sixth move, must put another M double minus. There weren't any other material errors in the next two moves of the game. So that's the way you want to write your games down, and then that is the way you should mark them. And your aim is not to have any of these M double minuses within at least 20 moves of any game you play. That's all for now. Good luck, and see you on the next tape.